Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Boundaries and Belonging. We are called to create boundaries. We are called to create boundaries without exclusion or chaos. This is our fourth webinar in a four-part series. The series is When Hospitality and Belonging Becomes Hard, Faith and Community Strategies for Responding to Adults with Varying Needs. Welcome, everyone. And for those of you who may have missed our past 3 webinars, we do invite you to please check out our other webinars. They have been recorded and are available on our website. This webinar is brought to you by AAIDD's Religion and Spirituality Interest Network and Stonebelt Arc. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Reverend Sarah McKenney from Stonebelt Arc, and I will be your tech host today. I know many of you, each time you get on Zoom, there's more different things in front of you as settings are always changing. This webinar will be recorded, so please make sure that you can check it out on our website. You can also look at it on Facebook, but I will be sending out an email a few days after, once this webinar has been uploaded to our website, to let you all know with the direct links how to get to the recording and all of our past webinars and their recordings. In that email, I will also include the PDF version of these slides. And you will also get some bonus features. You'll get some bonus resources from all of our presenters today. And you will also have a link you will get a link to a survey regarding our whole series. So please check all of that out. Again, that will be coming to you a few days after this to leave some time to get that up on our website. Now back to those Zoom instructions and Zoom information I was talking about earlier. Your microphone is muted. So at this point, we won't be able to hear all of you. However, you can use the chat icon for questions or comments throughout the webinar. Also, feel free to put your information, put your name, where you're from, what you do, why you're coming to this, and any other information that you would like to share with others. Or you don't have to, whatever you're comfortable with. You're welcome to use this as a networking opportunity. But yes, please put your questions in that chat icon. And also you may notice that this is closed captioning is available. You can turn this closed captioning on or off. If you go to the live transcript on your screen, you might have to move your mouse a little bit. You can either choose to hide or show those subtitles. You also have an option to see a running transcript, and that will go on the side of your screen, and you'll see like the full transcript as we go along, running in a bigger format. So that too is an option. And finally, you don't see it on your screen right now, but when we get toward the end, we will open this up for questions and hit questions directly. And you, at that time, you can use the raise hand option, but please reserve that for the end, and we can actually unmute you so you can orally ask your questions if that's more accessible to you. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put that in chat. I will also be sharing my email. If you're having any technology issues, you can send your questions through that email as well. Now, Without further ado, it is now time to meet our speakers. And to do this, I want to introduce you to Reverend Bill Gaventa, who will be our moderator today. Bill is an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant in the area of faith and disability. He is the founder, director emeritus of the Institute of Theology and Disability. He has served as the president of AAIDD from 2016 to 2017, and he is the author of Spirituality and Disability, Recovering Wholeness. Great book, check it out. And he has done and written much more, but without further ado, welcome, Bill. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Sarah, let's go to the next slide, and let me introduce some of the speakers who are going to be with us. You can read, and you have read perhaps their resumes or their brief bios that are on the slides, but a little personal word of introduction. We're delighted to have Tom Reynolds from Canada, from the Toronto School of Theology at Emmanuel College. He's both a parent and a theologian and author of Vulnerable Communion, a Theology of Disability and Hospitality, which was, I don't remember, Tom, when that was published, but it was one of the first parts of a new tide of resources and excellent books being published in this arena. And he's been to the Institute, on the Institute faculty, and a very important part of his life is that he is also a jazz pianist. So you may hear him using terms referring to that. Next slide. Dilshad Ali, I've gotten to know since I started reading the blog that she did, Musima Next Door, which was just a terrific blog about her life as a parent of a son on the autism spectrum, combining her reflections with her faith and philosophy and so many other things. She's an accomplished journalist. She's been featured in a variety of well-known news sources, and is just a delightful person, and smart as all get out. And the only strange thing about her is that you would never guess is her email indicates that she is from and was born and raised in North Dakota, which we usually wouldn't usually compute. And finally, let me introduce Rabbi Norman Cohen. I've just gotten to know Norman in preparation for this webinar. I've heard about him before from Shelley Christensen, who has spoken for a long time about what a fantastic person he is and the great work he has done at the synagogue that she attends in Minneapolis. I did not know that he was an author, writer, and professor as well, and noticed that his interest is broader than the Torah and Mishnah and Jewish tradition, but has also worked with the New Testament and other kinds of interfaith collaborations and conversations. So let's go. The series started with a conversation between Sarah and I and Amy Petre-Hill, who is also in the chat and on today, and Joanne Van Zant, all members of AAIDD. And we recognized pretty quickly that one of the things that we've heard as people who've been bridges between faith communities and people with disabilities and working with faith communities. One of the things we often hear in the world of inclusion ministries and supports is that some of the difficult times are when congregations welcome people whose behavior is different from the expected norms in that congregation or religious education program. The system calls them challenging behaviors. We've been very careful about the wording and the language we've used because we have not wanted at all to insinuate that challenging behaviors are only represented or exhibited by people with different kinds of disabilities. In fact, most pastors, rabbis, and imams would say there are probably a number of people in their faith communities who exhibit challenging behaviors at different times, but there may not be the kinds that sort of break behavioral kind of expectations, or what the autism world would call the hidden curriculum about how you are expected to behave when you walk into a faith community. And a lot of that, I think, over time has come from the fact that many people with different kinds of disabilities have not been brought up being included in faith communities, so haven't had the kind of opportunity to learn by doing it over and over and over again as they grew up. So what's expected becomes kind of second nature to you and ingrained in who you are and what you do. So we wanted to be very careful about that, but also address that there are issues at times. And the phrase that we used was one that I heard Fred Craddock's, one of the great Protestant homileticians, say in a talk at Princeton, that just because everyone's welcome doesn't mean anything goes. And we wanted in this series, and you've seen the titles, but today we wanted to close it up with some reflections by three people from different faith traditions in our country, and three of the major faith traditions, just to simply talk about the themes. They've watched some of the videos, we've talked together, and at first just start off with some reflections from their particular traditions and their work and their life experience. And then after we do those three short presentations, we'll move into conversation and dialogue between all four of us, and then also welcome questions from the chat. So let me start with Dilshad Ali, if we would. Dilshad, would you start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the lovely introduction. One correction, I wasn't born in North Dakota, okay, but I did grow up there. I grew up my entire childhood there. I was actually born in California. So I can claim West Coast, Midwest, and East Coast. I can claim it all. So I have been living in Virginia now for about 16, 17 years. And the majority of my parenting experience is here. And we have built relationships with some of the masjids or the mosques in our community. And, you know, one of the things that I have found, if we're talking about how do we welcome members of the congregation into our faith communities who have various different behaviors, different support needs, different things that they need, is that it's kind of a catch-22, because as Bill said, if it's not happening from an early age, if you're not building that relationship with your house of worship or your community of worship or your faith community from an early age, you're not going to get used to it, and neither is your community going to get used to you. And this is a struggle that we had as a family. I made a decision around that many years ago, and it has had like dropping a pebble in a pond. It has had a ripple effect that has gone on, and I don't feel bad about it, but I feel sad about it, in the sense that, you know, in the beginning when we moved here, we spent a pretty significant amount of effort to attend things like Jummah, Friday prayers. At the time, there was only like one or two mosques here in Richmond. Now there's several. And so we used to make an attempt to attend there. I would make an attempt to go to different programming at this mosque. And, you know, I have found that the issue isn't really the imam or the priest or the chaplain. I would imagine it's the crux of the challenge doesn't lie over there. The crux of the challenge lies in the congregational approach to when you try to be part of a faith worship. And one could take it back to the imam and say, you know, if you speak on these topics or if you model this behavior or something, you know, your congregation is going to follow forth. And, we spent a lot of time in the beginning trying. I spent a lot of time with my son on the playground while the rest of the family was inside praying Jummah prayers. I spent other times having him inside with me. And, you know, worship is worship, and there are rules of worship depending on which faith community you prescribe to, right? So, you know, we have prescribed salah, we have prescribed worship on, you know, 5 times a day. Friday prayers, you know, there are straight lines that need to be maintained. You're supposed to be shoulder to shoulder. They always tell you no gaps between the lines, you know, and you follow the imam in procession, and there's bowing and sujood and rukn, you know, the whole process of it. And my kid never could do any of that stuff, any of it. And so I like what Bill said about how when we talk about, you know, the challenges of different behaviors and stuff, it's not just relegated to families with disabilities, individuals with disabilities, you know, it goes across the board. So like, you know, I don't know about you guys, but we always have vigorous discussions about the place of children in our houses of worship, and, you know, how they can be disruptive sometimes, but you should be welcoming of children, but there should be a balance of how parents discipline their children and, you know, teach them, but also tolerance, because children are children. So there's all those things happening. And I felt like that kind of vigorous discussion was never happening around our congregational members with disabilities. And so when I started to get called out, you know, why is he twirling the beads on the window? Why is he running in between the lines? Why is he, you know, making noise? It just stopped being worth it to me. I was comfortable to worship in my house. I knew God would meet me wherever I was. I had the you know, religious ruling of, you know, women are not required to go to Friday prayers. So I didn't. And, but the ripple effect of making that kind of a choice is that, you know, oftentimes, you know, a woman becomes, you know, I mean, I hate to bring it down on gender lines, but it is what it is. A woman becomes the standard bearer of who goes, you know, to a service, or who goes to, you know, a worship service or a program or something. So if I stop going, it's not just I stop going and my eldest autistic son stopped going, but then my other 2 children stop going, which means they don't grow up in a house. They don't grow up in a masjid environment. And here we are now, and they're 21, 18, and 14. And sure, we'll go to Eid prayers as a family. That's an important thing to us. And we'll, you know, we'll try to attend different things here and there. But like our other community members around us who speak with such reverence and such love for the masjid experience and the mosque experience and the mosque community is something that's just lost on me. I don't feel bad about it, but I do feel sad about it for my other kids, you know? So, you know, when we talk about these different things, I think there's a lot to be said about that catch-22 of that education, you know, and the inclusion and the programming and the push doesn't happen unless it happens from those of us living the life. But for those of us living the life, sometimes we don't have, you know, the capacity to make that push in all areas of life, because you're making it in your educational life, you're making it in your family and social life, you're making it in all the other areas of life. And so something has to give at some point, right? So, you know, that's been an ongoing battle, I think. And I'm sure we can speak more on this. I'm sure the Rabbi and Thomas, you know, they'll have more to say on this. So, but these are some of the challenges that we're facing in our Muslim communities. And I feel like there's been a lot of progress that has been made, you know, in these areas. We've had organizations that have come forth and have really like grabbed that baton of awareness and you know, challenging our mosque communities and our faith communities in the American Muslim community to do better. But, you know, God, we have a long ways to go. And you know, we're still, you know, very far behind as to what other Abrahamic faiths and other faiths are doing in their communities. And so, you know, there's growth. I can be grateful for the growth for sure. But like, you know, when you see the growth nationally, but even in your small community, there's still so much to happen. It can be frustrating. But I'll stop there. I'm sure there's a lot more we can talk about, and, you know, we can move on to the next speaker.
I think Rabbi Cohen and Tom and everyone present could tell you 4 or 5, or if not more, stories that in their own faith tradition repeat the exact same thing. People who've known that. And it was certainly one of the reasons that I even got called into this area of ministry when I heard those stories from families a long time ago. And just for everybody's attention, you're going to get a great list of resources that have been provided by all the speakers that Sarah's put together, and Dilshad has done a new listing of what's available kind of in the Muslim world in the country these days. Rabbi Cohen, let's move on to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists and all of you who are online. We all have disabilities. Some of them are more visible and some are hidden deep inside. This may be a different way to think about the obvious stumbling blocks that stand in the way of full participation in religious life and ritual, and especially, as Dilshad pointed out, in the community, which is, we can be individuals, but we need community. We all do. But all of us are in the business of transforming attitudes and perspectives about disabilities. My thinking, of course, is formed and influenced by my Jewish source text. Ancient as some of them may be, they still provide contemporary wisdom and perspective that continues to guide us in our human interactions. I personally begin with Torah, Bible, and continue through contemporary resources. We have limited time today, so I'm going to share with you just a few of my favorite teachings. Number one, the ancient rabbis in a Talmudic discussion asked each other to choose what they thought was the most important Jewish teaching on anything. They cite many great texts, but the one that emerges at the end of the discussion is the Genesis story of creation, that the human is created in the image of God. If you begin with that, then all the other commandments and teachings follow. Because if you believe that and you look in the eye of another person, you'll see a divine spark. And then you'll know what to do in the presence of the other person, how to treat that person. And from that creation story, we also derive a precious principle for our interaction with other people and in thinking about ourselves as well. And that's the uniqueness of every human being. There was a rabbi named Zusya, and in this Hasidic story, he's about to die and he's very fearful. And his disciples asked him, "Why are you afraid? Are you afraid that when you get before God on high in the world to come, that God's going to ask you, why weren't you more like Abraham?" And he says, "No, I'm not afraid of that." He says, "Well, are you afraid that God's going to say, why weren't you more like Moses?" And Zusya says, "No." And they said, "Well, why are you trembling? What are you afraid of?" He says, "When I get up into the world to come, I'm afraid God's going to say, Zusya, why weren't you more like Zusya?" That's the first story that is constantly in my heart, in my mind. Second story is traversing the desert on our way from slavery to the promised land. We find ourselves standing at Mount Sinai, where we enter into our divine covenant with obligations and responsibilities. In the description of that assembly, the text uses a merism to describe the crowd standing at the foot of the mountain. And two occupations they mention that encompass the totality, that says specifically, all of you are here, and it says from wood chopper to water drawer. Now, if we imagine society as the societies we live in, like pyramidal social structure, this makes no sense because both of those tasks would be at the bottom of the pyramid, wood chopper, water drawer. But if we understand that the biblical verses are conveying the idea that all of us are on the same footing in God's eyes, then it's different. In other words, the social structure in this ideal picture is a circle, beginning with the wood chopper, standing next to the water drawer. But when you want to be inclusive, you go in this direction, not right next to each other. So if you move in the opposite direction, you end up full circle of including everyone in the entire group standing on the same level ground. It's an inspiring idea, but it conveys that there's no higher status from a spiritual perspective, that each and every person has an equal claim to be part of the community, of the group, deserving all the responsibilities, privileges, and opportunities as the next person. You might recall, you might say, but what about Moses? He was up at the top of the mountain. Well, the rabbis understood that with a sense of humor. They said that when he was standing up there with everyone down below, he looked down and he was humbled. At first, he was looking down and thinking, wow, look at me way up here and look at those tiny little figures down there below, you know? Well, just as that thought occurred, he noticed that his feet were still the same distance from his head as they always were. And he realized it was because of the mountain and his particular role that elevated him, but only for the purpose of serving them. So religious leaders must always bear that in mind, enabling us to lead more equitably and with justice. And the third text that I want to share with you in this brief time that I have is that religious institutions need to constantly strive to be welcoming and hospitable, no matter how welcoming and hospitable we are. And you alluded to this, Dilshad, we have to keep learning and keep trying to add new things. We have a memorable biblical paradigm for that as well. We might remember Abraham and Sarah sitting by the opening of their tent, flaps open, the tent flaps open, even in the heat of the day, so that they would not miss a soul who might be in the vicinity of their desert abode. They do not wait at the tent for others to come in, but they rush out. It says they ran out to greet even the stranger. They welcome them, offer them water and food, and serve as exemplars of hospitality. Contemporary spiritual homes, I believe, must do the same. We should be outreaching, contacting people in our communities before they present their issues to us. We can preserve their dignity and ours and elevate their sense of belonging in a powerful way. We need to transform our perspective from thinking that we are doing something for them. Rather, we can be working with them. If we have to think of others as them, if we do, we shouldn't, to create opportunities together. That to me is true inclusion. We have a video with examples of these kinds of situations, which we have encountered at Bet Shalom over the years, which will be available after the webinar in the material that Sarah will send out to anyone who wants to see that. Many spiritual homes have adapted their buildings to be more open and accessible to those with disabilities. We were fortunate in our congregation to design a new structure in 2001 and 2002, with all this in mind as we designed it. In our sanctuary, we have no so-called handicap ramp to go up to the pulpit. The floor itself is a rising slope as you approach. Everyone ascends the same way. Our mezuzot, the Jewish scriptural box on the doorpost, are placed halfway up instead of the more traditional place higher on the door jamb, so that all, including those in wheelchairs, and all of our children can perform the mitzvah of touching it and kissing it as we enter the building or into an individual room. Speaking of children, and I'll conclude with this, one of the most helpful things that can happen, better hope it happens, irritating to some, but enlightening to others, is when a child cries during a religious service. And Dilshad, you mentioned this as well. Instead of seeing it as an interruption, I think we can see it as a form of prayer. Of course, we need to respect boundaries for the sake of the sacred worship experience, but come on, we can be creative and compromising. Let's be proactive. If we're going to have a service with a different order than usual, for example, and we all know that in the case of people with autism, we should take a few minutes to indicate that before beginning, so that people with autism or on the spectrum or others who may find variation difficult to absorb will be less upset or not upset at all by those otherwise unexpected changes. And we can also reserve a room in the building for a very interruptive behavior with video and audio or visual access, a window to the service. Clear a space even in the sanctuary off to the side or some for those who need to get up and express themselves more actively with movement during prayer. And perhaps we should realize that there's nothing terrible about some disruptions, which could be transformed into learning opportunities by enlightened religious and community leaders. I cannot tell you how many times parents of kids with disabilities express gratitude for the opportunities to participate like everybody else. But all of us need to be grateful, not just people with those apparent disabilities. We all learn to be more aware, more sensitive, more able to learn how to respond. So I began my words today by saying that we all have some form of disability. Well, we must begin by creating and influencing a new way of thinking that benefits all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. learned some of the stories, a story about at the foot of Mount Sinai. I've got to go read now and look at it again. So, and I think this flows perfectly into what I think Tom may say, relating to a cry that comes from a person maybe in a congregational setting. Tom Reynolds, welcome.
Thank you. And it's a privilege to be on this panel, such rich stuff that I'm kind of, I resonate with the stories, Dilshad, you told, and I love the image of the open tent, because that is what I'd like to share. And in my experience of parenting and also advocacy work, I've come to see boundaries not as closures, but openings. And so I'd like to riff with that today a little bit and think of community as a co-creative event. Community is not something once and for all established, but constantly co-created. And I think the examples we've heard today are great. The community is actually about everyone, so that challenges aren't just coming from some, but the challenge is for all. In fact, in my journey with my son, I like to reverse it. It's not challenging behaviors, but those behaviors actually expose the challenges in the community that need to be transformed. So turning the mirror back on the community has been important for me in my journey. I like to think of boundaries then as thresholds in a community that support what people need to succeed and thrive together. Obviously, as we all know, too rigid and restrictive boundaries creates isolation and exclusion, and too loose and unstable lacks support. So it's a matter of navigating between those extremes, between exclusion and chaos, as the title of today's webinar, for belonging with all. So the community is a co-created affair. So I think then the sustainability of belonging and the welcome that animates it depends upon the boundaries that support and make possible life together. So challenges then become unique disruptions in a way of being that might be taken for granted. And in my experience, communities, and having journeyed through this multiple times in various faith communities I've been a part of, frustration and fear reactions are all too common. People aren't sure what to do. They're afraid of failing, perhaps made vulnerable. Things are called into question. It throws into relief the boundaries that a community has come to take for granted. So Bill mentioned the hidden curriculum, unexamined assumptions that communities treat as normal are suddenly unsettled, shaken up a bit. I like to think of this as an opportunity for the community to transform rather than for the behaviors alone to be addressed. Responses could be rejection and exclusion, where the person exhibiting behaviors is dismissed, or it could be one of pity and condescension, where the person is controlled, managed through programs which really end up isolating rather than co-creating community together. I think these reactions are more reactive than proactive. So I'd like to suggest communities can become proactive, preparing for, anticipating, expecting surprises. I love what Rabbi Cohen said about the congregation, built in a way that anticipates bodily differences so that co-creative community can be made more possible. So my turn of phrase that I like, that I think Bill referenced, was the provocation of a disruption is actually potentially an invocation to transformation together. It becomes a meaningful communication. In fact, it is a meaningful communication, maybe even a revelation, inviting response that in Christian traditions, I like to draw from 1 Corinthians 12 or Galatians 5, which speak of the work of the Spirit, opening gifts in the community that might otherwise be unanticipated. So this provocation could actually be an invocation, which does three things. One, it's a prophetic exposure of normalcy and ableism in a community. It throws the mirror back at a community, exposing the pretense to normalcy that might preoccupy business as usual in a community, a faith community. How boundaries are set up in ways that privilege neurotypical sensibilities, that privilege certain kinds of bodies, how unrealistic expectations get set up that actually provide and set up barriers to participation. So that's exposing. And I think that's the prophetic role of the provocation, which actually pushes back against the community. If a community is willing to discern this, and sometimes that's the hardest first step I've discovered in my own journey as a parent. That's the hardest first step, to go, oh, I made a mistake. I'm learning. Show me something in my journey with my son. The second thing, and I use the language of summoning, the kind of provocation that's an invocation summons me and the community into a new way of being together. I think a variety of ways. It's a call, the language call. I like summon because it almost reaches out to grab me. It says, you are being called, the vulnerable face of another, radiating the image of God, as Rabbi Cohen talked about, is a summons into co-creative community together. What this might mean is paying attention to particular needs that need support, different ways of participating, rather than a very thin list of what counts as adequate participation. Perhaps the summons is to open up the range of ways of participating, so that noise and crying might actually be productive, generative, enthusiastic ways that some people participate more robustly in a faith tradition. I think the summoning really, in the end, involves a spirituality of attentiveness that pays attention to the person and just not only the behavior, that focuses on connection with the person, that comes to know, that learns, that shows empathy, and maybe above all, opens to another in a non-anxious present. Instead of freaking out, to simply be present and acknowledge, okay, what's happening here? What can be learned? And how might we together go forward? Not, as Rabbi Cohen said, for, but with people and families. And then the third point, and I've already mentioned this, disruption can be a provocation into co-creative opportunity. And for me, the spirit blowing unpredictably surpasses expectation. It brings out gifts, and it comes as an unexpected guest. Hospitality is big here. And I think of, as Bill mentioned, and yes, I can't avoid mentioning jazz. So I'd like to think, in concluding, what preparing for and expecting and anticipating surprises might mean is, one, a tolerance for ambiguity and a willingness to be messy together. Like jazz performance, people don't know what they're going to play together, but responding to one another in the musical journey, new things happen. The music is co-created. It's not decided in advance, but it actually emerges through the musical conversation. Yes, this involves risk and the risk of failure, but without the risk of failure and growing together and unlearning what we thought was settled and relearning what might be possible together, the good music doesn't happen. We can talk more about that if people are interested, but I think the risk of making mistakes is part of being a transformative, co-creative community. And for me, the elasticity, the fluidity, the flow of keeping boundaries permeable, porous, is part of what genuine hospitality is. So I'll stop there and just conclude with the idea of seeing possibilities instead of problems is part of responding to challenges and disruptions as provocations that are actually a summons into being a new way together.
Boy, thank you all. I've been writing down notes like crazy. I don't want to tell you this story, that story, whatever, but I'm around with this group a lot. I wonder, Rabbi Cohen or any of you, if you'd like to respond to something that one of the other ones of you said. And I know you've done a little bit of that already.
You know, there's something that Thomas just, said about, the porousness of boundaries and of looking and putting that mirror back on the congregation, where if there's, a behavior or something that is disruptive or doesn't fit in with the neurotypical standard of behavior, how does that reflect upon the community? Like, how open and welcoming are you to be able to work with that? And my two colleagues here on the panel, are, as I would say in my tradition, mashallah, they're educated in their faith traditions. They have masters and they're rabbis and they're that. And my background is not. My background is journalism. But it does remind me a lot of a particular line from the Quran. You know, I would say in the early years of my parenting journey, I really drew a lot on this particular line from the Quran, from Surah An-Shara, that says, فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, which is verily with difficulty comes ease. And it's repeated twice, verily with difficulty comes ease. And it's kind of like what you cling to when you're dealing with a lot of challenges and difficulties, and that at some point in your life, there's going to be ease that comes. And now, you know, where I'm parenting a wonderful young man who was a wonderful kid, and now he's a young man, it really makes me think of the line from Surah Rahman, which is فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ, which is verily, which favors of your Lord would you deny? And that really makes me think of your mirror situation, because I mean, in a sense, you know, they're all favors that are coming from God, you know, whether it's in the form of something that's different about you, your disability or whatever, or, you know, whatever it is about you, it's your favor, depending on how you want to look at it. And why would you deny it? And how would that fit in with everyone around you? So I felt like I've come from a verily with difficulty there's ease to a what favor of my Lord will I deny kind of a mindset, which has been a game changer for me and only took me like 10, 12 years to get there. But, you know, it makes me think of one of the things that we're talking about here is, you know, the ability to look at who wants to be part of our congregations and how welcoming are we and how porous are those borders. And one of the things I think a point that's important to make is that, you know, families and individuals with disabilities, when they're making that effort to be part of a congregation, to be part of a faith community, you have to understand they're already considering a lot, and they're thinking about a lot of things before they come into that situation. So I really feel like anecdotally, a lot of us don't mean to be disruptive or mean to be, you know, taking away from the worship experience of those around us, but we still want to be a part of it, right? So like, we have thought really hard about this before taking that first step into that house of worship or into that community space. And, you know, that's, I think, a grace that I think sometimes is missed between the general congregation, that there's, you know, there's a grace that needs to be shared between us, because there's a lot of thought that went into that decision to actually come out that day, right? I have a fellow board member at Muslim, a wonderful young man. I'll call him young, even though I know he's in his 30s, but he's younger than me. And, you know, he is in a wheelchair, and he was talking in our last board meeting about how there's a general, you know, frustration that happens when he's trying to attend worship services, and like the handicap parking space has someone else parked in there, or that gap that's supposed to be around the handicap parking space for a wheelchair to come out, there's someone that's car has come too close in there, and his father might get angry or his children might get angry. And he's like, I don't want anyone to be angry when I'm trying to like come to a worship service, and it makes me not want to come. So, you know, that thought process of like, what is that family? What is that individual? You know, what have they thought about? How have they planned? How have they practiced to actually come to that moment to enter? And so how important is that first impression of receiving them, right? It's just something that your words made me think about, Tom.
And I think that's one of the practical things for a lot of faith communities to think about, especially people who've been doing inclusion. Is, are we ready, prepared for a new person who comes in, a new family? Because like you said earlier in the image was this stone in a pond, you know, because if a bad experience will ripple out among a family's relatives and friends and so on. Could you all address something where not the welcoming and being prepared, but when something unusual or disruptive happened, how did the community respond in terms of gathering around a person and hearing that difference as a kind of plea for support, and what kind of support evolved from that? Do you have an example? I've got some examples in my head, but I wondered if you all have had.
I definitely have
practical
examples, but I just spoke, so maybe somebody
Yeah.
else.
Rabbi.
Yeah, I want to respond to what Dishad said, because she really filled the room with lots of good things to think about. Dishad, I know you were very deferential talking about us having our degrees and all that stuff, but you're an expert. I mean, you've raised a child with autism, and nobody has more expertise in helping a community understand how it can be welcoming than someone like you. And I hope that you continue to share that with your imam and with the leaders in your mosque. Our tradition, I think if people paid attention to the words of prayers rather than just rattling and not thinking of what they mean, I think the prayer book is designed to raise our consciousness. There is a wonderful daily prayer in the Jewish liturgy, which says, "Blessed art thou, O God, sovereign of the universe, who creates a variety of people, a variety of creatures." I mean, this is helpful not just with our thinking about people with disabilities, but it works in so many situations across racial boundaries, gender boundaries. I mean, this is a prayer that helps us to rethink things. But I think that it has to come also from the leader of a community, because we're up on the pulpit and we see what's going on out there. And often after every service, there's always follow-up to do during the week. And I can tell sometimes who the people are who are disturbed by disruptions, and I usually try to approach them and try to work with them and try to, starting off by respecting their discomfort and then talking with them. And this has worked in so many different cases. There was one young man, and yes, Dishad, for me, young man is a much broader category, but young man who used to come and he would flail during services and get up and down and make music. We have a musical service every month, and he would take a musical instrument and constantly do this. And there was one person in particular who didn't like any kind of disruptions. And eventually, through a series of talks and introducing them, that other member of the synagogue invited this young man to sit next to him at services. And that's what his seat was every week. And that was something, a joy to see. But I think when a community begins to respond in a welcoming, favorable way to particular situations, word travels fast. Word travels fast in the community where people who are families with disabilities, they get together for support and whatnot. And, oh, there's a great place. One should come to this place next week. And the community then becomes, I think, a real comfortable home for everybody. And, like I said before, I've had parents call me sometimes when we started mainstreaming some of the kids who, like in public schools, we put in their own special needs class or something like that. And we tried to do mainstreaming whenever we could. And a couple of parents came, why is my kid in the class with this disruptive kid? And the person needed to see that their child is going to learn just as much as the person with disabilities about how to deal with other people in the world. We don't live in these sort of bubbles. We live in the world that has God's variety of creation. And when we come to see the world that way, I think it makes it a lot easier to live. And so everybody benefits. That was my point before. I hope that answers your question.
Tom, do you have a story about how maybe a community has responded either to Chris or to someone else?
Yeah, I have a story about my own community where, and my way of thinking about this musically would be where perceived dissonance became an invitation to wrap around and create harmony. There was a particular mental health challenge, and the community recognized, and I'm a musician in my church, this person loved to sing. And it was the community was discerning how to foster participation in a way that found the middle ground between rigid boundaries and between exclusion altogether. And so One, we worked with agencies in the local community to find support and learn about this person. Two, we found ways, and it turns out that this person loved the music we were doing. So this person then, moving closer to the music, became elated, and it was the greatest gift in the world, because the person brought us all gifts after a service one day, and I cried because it was this gesture of participation, of feeling like there was participation, that elicited gifts from this person. And yeah, I saw that as, well, it took a bit to discern, but the community didn't give up on it, which is what I really appreciated. And I don't think there's 5 easy steps to fostering these things that everybody can follow. It's a matter of riffing with one another and adapting and improvising and discerning needs, but also collaborating with people outside the congregation who may know better, like an agency and support staff. So that would be something I'd offer.
I remember a story from a Catholic friend of mine. An older man had a stroke in their congregation, and he would still come to Mass, but taking communion was the paramount thing for him. So even before the homily, when the communion follows that, he would often come up and stand right by the front pew, because he wanted to be first in line for the receiving communion, or maybe earlier, before the actual people were supposed to come, but during the part of the ceremony before the people were invited up. And that created a buzz for some people. And why should he do that? But if people gathered around and thought with him and thought with the group, and the simple answer was, put a chair there, something like that. So I think the kinds of success stories that I've heard about are when people then, if something's happened, Norm, I love the fact that you've talked to the people who were disturbed, but then to the people who maybe were doing the challenge, the family talked with them and their son or daughter, or the adult male with mental illness, and help figure out what's going on and what that behavior is communicating, and what they want, what they like. I think part of the series has been behaviors communication. So how do we help people who obviously yearn to participate in ways where they want? I think most people want to learn what to do in those settings, and it just may take some patience and time. Rabbi Cohen, and then
very quickly, Bill, I have to confess, I have a secret weapon. Shelley Christensen's been a member of my congregation for 40 years. And I have an instant consultant right there. And believe me, Shelley and I had sort of this beeline in communication. We still do, even though I'm retired now. She is just great. I know she travels around, but there are other Shelley Christensens around in different communities. And I think that the leaders, the lay leaders, and the pastoral leaders of communities need to have those people available to them and not be afraid to call and ask for things. As far as music goes, I see someone like the example of music, and we have 2 musicians, Thomas and Dilshad are both musicians. Music is one of the most wonderful ways of including people. And one of the young men in our congregation, no one knew this. He had autism, and he was a brilliant musician, never used a piece of music either. And when we found that out, we occasionally would have a weekend concert and would have different members of the congregation perform. We called him and asked him if he would do something. And first of all, the look on his face, I mean, it just lit up. And when he sat at that piano and played, the entire congregation was just in a spell. And I think people after that, when they approached him, they saw him not as a person with autism. They saw him a person with amazing skills and a unique kind of a personality. And that sometimes it's those things that create the bridges. So
yeah. All right, Dilshad, quick comment.
Well, I was just saying that I think we undervalue how important communication is as part of this whole process. I mean, I think it seems to me in our congregational settings, if we see someone who is struggling or is out of that neurotypical box, you might hesitate to ask or offer help or try to understand, but and we undervalue that communication. And it just reminds me of an experience gone wrong, an experience gone right. And the wrong one was, which was led me to stop going to Tarawih prayers and to iftar, breaking our fast iftar at the mosque, because I remember going and taking my kids with me, and including my eldest when he was much younger. And it was just so much I was trying to manage. And, I broke the fast and I had to take him out of the main hall setting because it was just too much. And as I stayed with him and helped him kind of find his calm, the congregation prayed Maghrib prayers. And I texted my husband, I was like, look, I'm taking him home. This isn't working. And I went home and I was like, oh my God, I just spent the whole day fasting. I prayed and I didn't even pray Maghrib. And like, am I losing my fast today? Right. And I was like, that's it. I'm not going through this chaos. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not taking him. You all go. I'm not going to go anymore. That was a situation gone wrong. If anyone had seen or asked or anything, it could have gone in a different way. And then, so now the only thing we do as a family is Eid prayers. And, there was a time we went to Eid prayers, and usually pre-COVID, they happen at like a stadium or a convention center here where I live. And so, all the entirety of our city's Muslim community tries to gather in one spot. So it's a lot of people. He did have a meltdown and on the floor, and, it was the communication. There are people who said, listen, I don't want to make it harder for you, but what can I do to help? That's really all it took. And I was like, what I need you to do is to find my husband. That's all I need you to do. And, that's what they did. And that's what made the situation get better, right? We undervalue communication, I think, too much. That's really the point I wanted to make.
Yeah. And you're going to get in your resources some, in terms of practical things, some great stuff that comes out of what's called in the field of positive behavior supports. That comes out of schools and school systems, because there's such a huge difference between listening well and hard and then figuring out ways of support versus trying to manage or reward or punish somebody's behavior. There's such a huge difference in that. I am very aware that we have just gotten started and it's almost time to close. With this, I don't know if there's any comment, Joanne or Amy, or is there any comment that you'd like to make as one of the other participants in this?
Joanne and Amy, if you want to speak, go ahead and raise your hand and I will give you permissions.
Amy.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of the panelists and for Bill. What I really love is that hospitality and all of the examples you're talking about flows through every kind of faith community. And you've just made that so clear. Being compassionate, welcoming into faith communities is a common human experience. But you've talked about how it is in your communities, and it's a tremendous gift. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Joanne?
Yes, I too would like to thank you for the presentations. You put into words things I work with on a regular basis to help me understand, and I lead worship for a congregation of a variety of abilities, and I can support all what you've said about communication and blending of the typical and with friends to friends and with my chaplaincy. So, and how much it is important to find out what people can do and lift them up. Communication is significant. So I really appreciate the messages and the words and the way I can continue to communicate and advocate for the community. So I do think this was a great conversation. So thanks so much.
I think one of the things we did not have time to get into, which we talked a little bit before in preparation, is to also remember that some of these situations can be full of a lot of humor and revelation. I mean, if people care and are willing, if we can hold up a mirror, sometimes it gets really important for us to be able to laugh at ourselves or to see ourselves in new ways around this. I go back to one time, a long time ago, when I was taking a group of people to Catholic Mass, and one of the women from our center, right after a priest finished his a very enthusiastic profession of faith, which was beyond his usual demure behavior, the woman stood up right in front of me and started clapping from our center. And I just about wanted to sink behind the thing, thinking, you're jeopardizing your acceptance. And what I really meant was, you're jeopardizing my acceptance here. And they invited me back 3 weeks later to do the homily in the service. And I ended up saying, didn't what Florence did, if we all said the profession of faith with heart, mind, body, and soul, and got to the end of that, and it was a true reflection of our enthusiasm for our faith, should we all not clap at the end of that, and to celebrate that profession of faith for everyone? So remember that. You all know this. There are times when this can be really helpful, and certainly seeing something new and be what Tom has so rightly called an inbreaking of the spirit in Christian terms. So for us to be true to time, I want to thank Rabbi Cohen and Dilshad Ali and Tom Reynolds profoundly for this. And all I can say is these folks have wealth of experience and knowledge, and so do a lot of you. And these are the kind of conversations I hope we can have more and more of within not only the disability and ministry community, but also with the wider community that helps congregations prepare for whoever and whatever walks through that door, because they want to be there. Thank you all for being here today, and a huge hand to Sarah and to Stonebelt Arc, who have managed these 4 webinar series with great skill. And we are very appreciative of that. And thank you all. And if you have ideas for us for a future webinar series, or maybe we should come back to this one with real life examples or something, let us know. You'll have our emails in different ways, but we welcome input about the kinds of things we can do. And one of the things the AIDD group can do, I think, is to have the kind of interfaith connections and interdisciplinary connections that can help us look at some of these things that we're all learning about what it means to be God's people. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day. Sarah, thank you.
Absolutely. Just one reminder, I will be looking for an email in the next few days. In that email, I will give you a number of things, a direct link to this webinar recording, a link to all past webinar recordings of this series, and a PDF of the beginning slides. You'll also get a bonus resource brought to you by all of the panelists here. And I'll also send a full transcript for anybody who needs the written dialogue. And I will also save the chat, as a lot of you shared resources and information. Feel free to email me if you have any additional questions, and I will get them to the panelists. Thank you all.